I'm Christina Page, and I'm the chair of the SRWMP Training Committee. Today, I will be here moderating with Alyssa Ambacher. I'd like to point out something that's on the webinar panel on your screen. You'll see a drop-down on the side that says handouts. In that drop-down, you'll find today's agenda, so please refer to that as we go through today's presentation. Next slide. So continuing education credits have been approved by the SRP Licensing Board. When you registered, if you elected to receive CECs for today and meet the requirements listed on this slide, you'll receive 2.5 CECs, which are 0.5 regulatory and 2 technical. In order to be eligible to receive the CECs for today, you must remain on the webinar for the entirety of the presentation and answer 3 out of the 4 poll questions. Next slide. After today's presentation, the department will provide a list of eligible participants to the LSRPA who assist the department with the CEC process. After that, you'll receive a link, pay your fee, and then the certificate will be issued and you'll receive that via email. Next slide. As I mentioned, you'll have to answer 3 out of 4 poll questions throughout today's presentation. This is what our poll slides look like, and when they come up, you'll have a minute to answer. I looked for a way to incorporate what special day today might be in the tradition of Dr. Barry Frasco. So as our sample poll question today, I found out that Roger Ferguson's birthday might be today. Is that true or false? Next slide. And the answer is false. It was yesterday. So happy birthday, Roger. And I'm going to turn this over to Alyssa to continue moderating.
Hi, everyone. Tyrone, you can go to the next slide, please. Throughout today's presentation, there will be question and answer segments. You can enter your questions in the question box, and the moderators, myself and Christina, will read them out loud during the question segments as time permits. Sometimes we get a lot of questions and there just isn't enough time to answer them all. So any questions that are not addressed during today's presentation will be answered via email. It might take a few weeks, but we will get all those questions answered. Your email address is recorded when you ask the question, so you'll definitely get a response. Next slide, please. There's also a chat function. We ask that you use the chat function just to let us know if there are any technical issues during the presentation, although we find that a lot of times just leaving and coming back in solves a lot of the technical problems that you might have. Do not use the chat function to comment on presentations or to answer other attendees' questions. And in addition, I believe there is a hand raising function. However, we're not using that to call on anyone during today's presentation. Next slide, please. In addition, there is a SurveyMonkey for our course evaluation. So we really ask that you take just a moment to fill that out at the end of the presentation, and you'll be able to access that in the chat box. And it will be posted regularly throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. So without further ado, I'm going to ask that Roger Ferguson come on to give us some LSRPA updates. Thank you, Roger.
Good morning, thank you. And good morning, everybody. Hopefully everyone is doing well. It's still a little bit crazy out there. As always, the LSRPA is glad to partner with the department to help put these training classes on. We're here specifically today, or I'll be here later, to talk about the fill material guidance. And we'll come back and talk about the historically applied pesticide guidance. And of course, we have been approved by the licensing board, yay, for technical and regulatory credits. Next slide, please. Thank you. As always, we commend you to thank our sponsors. Please visit them. Hire them even. That's why they're here after all. So you can see our diamond sponsors and our platinum sponsors. Next slide, please. And our gold partners. Next slide. and our silver partners. Again, all of our sponsors help the LSRPA do everything that we do for the our community. So we appreciate their services. Next slide, please. Upcoming courses. March 15th, we're doing a regulatory roundtable, recycled concrete aggregate, what every LSRP and their client needs to know. March 16th is a session on response action outcome updates for LSRPs. And March 24th, the Aspiring Professional Series will do visual understanding of groundwater contamination. You can check your schedules. The regulatory roundtables have been pretty successful in that there's not a lot of people talking at you. There's a lot more interaction, so people might find that interesting. Next slide, please. March 29th, the joint event with DCONE, SWEP, and the New York City Brownfield Coalition on Women in Environmental Professions. DEP training on Chapter 2 updates to the Field Sampling Procedures Manual. And April 20th, due diligence in New Jersey for 2 regulatory and technical credits each. Next slide, please. And if you haven't figured it out, we moved the conference into June. We will be in person in New Brunswick. We're all looking forward to it. We've all been cooped up for way too long. So by all means, sign up. The continuing education classes are posted on that. But one other thing about continuing education is that be on the lookout. We're going to reschedule the professional judgment class for some time in the near future. So next slide, please. And of course, stay connected. You know where to find us. Next slide. Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger. As always, we appreciate our collaboration with the LSRPA. Before I announce our first presenter, I just want to point to the chat for everybody to take a look. I dropped a link to the site remediation program's acronym glossary. It's for your use in case there's an acronym that you might not be familiar with. It's there today. So right now, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Greg Newman. Go ahead, Greg.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Greg Newman. I'm with the Bureau of Environmental Evaluation and Risk Assessment and was co-chair of the Field Committee. Just wanted to thank you for attending today's presentation. And to start off with, I'm going to provide you with an overview and go into some detail regarding the pre-approval process for the use of alternative fill. Next slide, please. First off, I just wanted to let everybody know what the committee was comprised of. On the DEP side, we had Anthony Fontana from Solid Waste and Amanda Gettelfinger and Milo Ramirez, both of BIRA. On the external side, we had Roger Ferguson as co-chair with Penn Jersey, Carrie McGowan from Kennedy Jenks, Neil Rivers from Langen, Brian Montag from K&L Gates, and lastly, Kathleen Murray from Terra Incorporated. Just wanted to thank all of the committee members for putting forth a great effort to get this document out onto the street where it can be used. It's a volunteer effort. It takes a lot of time, and I just want to let everybody know, in terms of the committee members, I thank you for your efforts. Next slide. So just a brief outline to give you a high-level view of what we're going to be covering today. I'm going to be providing you with an overview of the document, as well as going into some detail on the pre-approval process. We will then cover the uses of alternative fill, both off-site as well as on-site. We'll be covering some material considerations that apply mostly to both off-site and on-site alt fill. We will also be covering the subject of clean fill. And lastly, we'll be providing you with a review of what a fill use plan should look like in terms of essential elements that should be included in all fill use plans, which we spelled out in Appendix B in the format of a checklist. So that's kind of what we're going to be covering today. Next slide, please. Just to set the stage from a regulatory perspective, this new guidance of the fill guidance was released on October 21 in its version 4, which replaces the prior version, which was version 3, which was released in August 2015. One of the major drivers to revise the guidance was to incorporate the pre-approval process, which was contained in the tech rules, which were revised in August of 2018. Just a quick note on the limitation of this guidance, since we're often asked this. This fill guidance only applies to sites under SRWMP oversight. It does not apply to typical construction sites. Landfills is also a carve out from this guidance document from the perspective that they have to go through landfill closure through solid waste. I did want to make you aware that New Jersey DEP has issued some dirty dirt legislation that was issued by solid waste, just to make you mindful of that. Important to note that this version, similar to prior versions, does endorse the provisions of the like-on-like and 75th percentile. The idea here is that we want to promote the use of alternative fill in a responsible manner and not make the contamination at the receiving site worse. And lastly, as an overriding theme, we want to make sure that in all instances when alternative fill is used, it must be protective of human health and the environment. Next slide, please. Okay, when is pre-approval required for the importation of off-site fill? So the triggers for written pre-approval can be found in the tech rules at section 5.2C1 through 3. And basically, pre-approval is required when alternative fill does not comply with the like-on-like provision, which means that the donor material contains a contaminant that's not present at the receiving AOC, or the donor material does not comply with the 75th percentile of the existing contaminants at the receiving AOC, or the use of donor alternative fill causes an exceedance of the pre-remediation topography at the receiving AOC. So if you hit on any one of those three triggers, written pre-approval is required by the department prior to the importation of that fill for use. Next slide, please. Okay, what are the triggers for on-site alternative fill? The trigger for written pre-approval for the relocation of on-site fill can be found in the tech regs at 5.2D2. And specifically, written pre-approval is required if the contaminants in the donor material are not present at the receiving AOC. So you're not meeting like on like at concentrations above the remediation standards. So under this scenario, an example might be if you had a receiving AOC that contains lead and arsenic at concentrations above the standard, and you had donor material from an on-site AOC that contains lead, arsenic, and then perhaps benzoate pyrene. So in this instance, the presence of benzoate pyrene in the donor material, which is not present at the receiving area, would require DEP written approval prior to use. There were some other provisions on the use and movement of on-site alternative fill to meet regarding this scenario that will be covered in more detail a little bit later in this presentation. So pre-approval is not required when contamination in the donor material is also present at the receiving area. So in this scenario, the like and like is met, and that's specified at 5.2D1. Just a quick note, this guidance document does highlight the fact that the relocation of on-site donor material to a clean area of the site is prohibited. Next slide, please. All right, so what needs to be done or included with the pre-approval process? So on-site and off-site written pre-approval requests must include the information outlined in the tech rule at 1.7a as part of the pre-approval request. So what does 1.7a require? 1.7a requires the following technical information and the submission of a variance form. as part of the variance form, you must provide the regulatory citation for the tech rule from which you are varying from. You must include a description of how the proposed variance deviates from the regulatory requirement, and you must provide the rationale for varying from the cited technical requirement that includes how the variance will provide results that are verifiable and reproducible, achieves the objective of the cited tech requirement, and provides further attainment of the purpose of the specific remedial phase. Next slide, please. Okay, so a word of caution here, and this is important. As per 1.7b6, the person responsible for conducting the remediation cannot vary from a requirement to obtain the department's written pre-approval. And as per 1.7b7, the person responsible for conducting the remediation cannot vary from the requirements of 5.2b. That is, you may not vary from the requirement to obtain written pre-approval if not meeting the like-on-like, the 75th percentile, or using alt fill above pre-remediation topography elevations. Next slide. So how does the pre-approval process work? You know, the committee went through some effort and really tried to detail this procedure so it's clear. And we did that in section 4.9 of the guidance document. And it basically consists of 4 steps. You know, step 1 is just a conference call reaching out to the department to discuss, you know, the conceptual approach regarding the use of alt fill that's not meeting or that's triggering the pre-approval process. And the idea here is to identify any major potential concerns and just have a high-level discussion with the department about the project, so we have an understanding of what your issues are with pre-approval. Step 2 would be a follow-up technical meeting, you know, to discuss the approach in more detail. If there are any major concerns identified in step 1, you know, how do you address them? At this point in the project, you should be further enough along in terms of the design, to the extent that, you know, the areas to be filled should be identified. Has the receiving area been characterized? You know, what type of volumes are we talking about here in terms of importation of alternative fill? Is it 1,000 yards or is it 10,000 cubic yards? And what are your target elevations? You know, what are those target elevations relative to the 100-year floodplain? Again, Appendix B of the fill guidance document includes a checklist. I would encourage you at this point, you know, as part of this step 2 technical meeting, to provide any information you can relative to the checklist so we have a really good understanding of what your project involves. Next slide, please. So step 3 involves, you know, the development of an administratively complete pre-approval proposal by the LSRP. You know, it should include a narrative describing, you know, why the alternative is needed to implement the remedial action. It should include a discussion of how site receiving criteria in terms of the like-on-like and 75th percentile were developed, you know, with supporting tables and figures. If you're proposing to import fill and use it over 10 acres of your site, we want to see where your characterization samples were, you know, that help you calculate the 75th and like-on-like. Again, please consult Appendix B and provide all the information that we're asking for there in the checklist. At this stage of the game, you know, we're going to be looking for any public notification that's required as a component of ARCs, and we'll be touching on that in a little bit more detail a little bit later on in the presentation. Next slide. So step 4 is the actual pre-approval submission by the LSRP to the department via the e-portal as part of a RAW, with the pre-approval proposal being a component of the fill use plan. And I just wanted to note something here because this is often overlooked. The submission of a fill use plan is required as part of the RAW pursuant to the tech rules at 5.2H. Once that complete submission comes in for pre-approval, the department anticipates a good faith effort to meet a 45-day review period for turnaround time and receiving comments from the department on the pre-approval proposal. Next slide. Okay, so what are some of the criteria that the department will evaluate your proposal against? So I'm going to cover this for all three of the triggers, and we're going to start with the use of alt fill where it's proposed above pre-remediation topography. The LSRP and the developer need to keep in mind that the remediation needs are the primary goal for the use of alt fill. So with that stated, is the use of alt fill as part of the remedial action described in the fill use plan? It should be. Redevelopment projects requiring alternative fill should, to the extent possible, incorporate designs, features, and strategies to minimize the use of alternative fill, to only that required to implement the remedial action. And we'll be evaluating your proposal to see if that minimization has occurred or if it's possible. The use of alt fill up to the 100-year floodplain. In that instance, that places your engineering controls, which may consist of soil caps or building slabs, parking lots, above the flood elevation. That's an example where alt fill is being used as part of the remediation to get the engineering controls up above the 100-year floodplain. If you're going above the 100-year floodplain, you have to describe why that's necessary and how that's tied to remediation. Next slide. So again, focusing on pre-remediation topography, is grading being conducted with the existing material to minimize the volume of alt fill needed? If you have a 5-acre site and at a 1/2-acre portion of the site that's several feet higher than the rest, are you proposing to import fill to meet that high point over a small area? Or can grading of that high area be implemented where that material is moved across the site to reduce the ultimate volume of fill needed? Are there stormwater or flood hazard requirements that are specifying you need to meet a specific elevation? If that's the case, provide that documentation from the land use program so it's part of the fill use plan. Is the fill needed to address the essential development features? If so, what are they? And is minimization being incorporated to help reduce the total volume of alternative fill being brought to the site? Are there unique construction obstacles or physical hazards that are driving the need for alt fill? Again, if there are, please describe them. Professional engineer input. The use of alternative fill can range anywhere from backfilling a simple excavation to its use at several feet, maybe up to 10 feet, may involve the placement of fill on steep slopes with unstable soils that's adjacent to water bodies where those materials may be subject to wave erosion and tidal cycling. Obviously, as the complexity of the use of alt fill increases from an engineering perspective, we highly encourage the LSRP to seek professional engineer input to help design those features relative to the use of alternative fill. If there are any PE certifications associated with design features, please incorporate them into the fill use plan. Community acceptance and public notification are important things that we're looking for. And again, those will be discussed in some detail later on in the presentation. Next slide. Okay, moving on to not complying with the like on like. If you're proposing to import alt fill with contaminants that are not already at the receiving area, that could constitute a new discharge or de facto landfilling. So that's something we want to look at carefully. How many contaminants in the donor material do not comply with the like on like? Is it, if you have 5 samples at your receiving area that all contain metals, are you proposing to bring in, 10 metals or 10 metals and 5 BOs? So what's actually exceeding the like on like in terms of not meeting it in comparing the donor material to the receiving area contaminants? What is the volume of alt fill, not compliance with the like on like? If you have 10 samples that are characterizing 10,000 cubic yards of donor material? Is it just one of the samples that doesn't comply, or is it half of them? What's the analytical fraction? If you only have metals at your receiving area, are you proposing to perhaps bring in some additional metals? Or does the donor material also contain contaminants of a different analytical fraction, such as VOs or base neutrals or pesticides? Again, all of these reasons are very site-specific from case to case, but ultimately they have to be technically justified by the LSRP, and they have to be protective. Next slide, please. Okay, donor material non-compliance with the 75th percentile. Again, this would obviously be involve bringing contaminants in the donor material that are present at higher concentration than the receiving site's 75th percentile, and could essentially be viewed as making the contamination worse. The frequency of the contaminants that exceed the 75th percentile, and what is their magnitude? These are the things that we're going to be looking at in evaluating your proposal. And similar to the last slide, these are going to be very site-specific based on what's present in your receiving area and what's present at your donor material. But at the end of the day, it's up to the LSRP to justify their use and make sure that they're protective. At this point, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Neil, who's going to cover in a little bit more detail the issue of community acceptance and public notification.
Great, thank you so much, Greg. And Neil, it looks like you're ready to go, so take it away.
I am, thank you. Let me have you advance the slide, Tyrone. Good morning, everyone. As Greg mentioned, community acceptance and public notification are aspects of the fill use process that the department is concerned about and wants to see addressed as part of the fill use plan and also the pre-approval process. Run through that a little bit this morning. So first and foremost, I want to encourage you to plan for community and local government concerns about the use of alternative fill before the project starts, before you're moving trucks through the community. You're going to avoid project delays, local concerns through that process. Secondly, this is not a new requirement, as some people thought. The ARC's requirements at 1.7I and K, and I'll talk about those here, were in place in 2012. So literally the community acceptance aspects of the use of alternative fill and the fill use plan have been in place for 10 years. Advance, Tyrone? Thanks. Okay, so in ARC's 1.7K, it states that public notification is required when the use of alternative fill is subject to department pre-approval. Greg just went through that listing of the requirements for pre-approval. In those instances, then you're going to do community notification to property owners within 200 feet of the site boundary, the local mayor and municipal clerk, the county designated solid waste coordinator, and the county health department and local health agency. Next slide, please. So what are you including in that information? Well, in accordance with ARCs, you must include information about the types of contaminants that are in the alternative fill, the concentration of those contaminants in the fill, the proposed use and volume of the alternative fill, and the controls designed to reduce or eliminate exposure. Now, in the guidance document, we talk about the idea that you could provide the community with the fill use plan. You're going to be preparing it for the department anyway as part of the requirements under the tech rule. Or alternatively, you could consider providing a simpler format, maybe better suited to the layman, so a little bit easier for them to understand. Either is acceptable. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we have our first poll question. As we mentioned earlier, there will be 4 throughout the presentation. So the first one is true or false. Per ARCS, the type of contaminants in the alt fill must be included in the community acceptance and public notification information. So once Tyrone launches the poll, there it is. You have about a minute to answer. Just a reminder that we do have the SurveyMonkey link that will be posted in the chat, so you can fill that out at your leisure. It really helps us come up with more trainings and target the areas that need to be targeted. It looks like a lot of people have voted. Make sure you get your vote in, just because you do need to have 3 out of 4 poll questions answered in order to get your CECs. They don't need to be correct, you just need to answer them. Looks like just about everyone has voted, so if you haven't, just make sure you get that in. You have a few more seconds. Okay. Next slide, please. And the answer is true. All right, back to you, Neil.
Thank you. Yes, the answer is true. Provide that information about the contaminants in the alternative fill as part of your information to the community. So I mentioned the 2 ARCS citations. 1.7i is a citation that Greg mentioned earlier, and that is that that there is a requirement to provide the remedial action work plan to the local government agencies when they request it, as part of the public notification process. And per the tech regs at 5.2H, the remedial action work plan must include the fill use plan whenever alternative or clean fill will be part of the remedial action. So again, ARCS has these 2 requirements for community acceptance and notification, whether it's providing the RAWP, but also the general information about the use of alternative fill. If you'd advance, please. Okay. Remember also that in addition to the entities that I listed earlier that are required under ARCS, depending upon the nature of the project that you're working on, you may have other local boards or regional boards that might have some jurisdiction over the work or the project that you're doing. For example, if the site is a brownfield being developed or redeveloped, there may be requirements by the local planning or zoning board to submit some form of an environmental impact statement or other general information about the importation of fill. So you may need to be providing some of this information to those boards. Similarly, if your project is in specific areas of the state, such as the Highlands, the Pinelands, or the Meadowlands District, there are individual regional boards that also may have requirements that you provide public notification information to them. Next slide, please. Okay. As Greg mentioned, in addition to the other items that you're providing to the department as part of the pre-approval process, the department is going to want you to document the fact that you have delivered the information to the community. Now that could be read receipt or return receipt or similar type of documentation through the use of, say, Federal Express or certified mail, something like that. Perhaps there may be correspondence from the municipality or some municipal resolution acknowledging the information that was provided as part of a planning board approval or a zoning board approval, for example. The other thing that the department is expecting that you do is you're going to notify them if the fill use plan changes due to public input. That's entirely possible. The community may have comments. The design for the property may change, particularly through the planning process. And if those changes are going to influence how fill is going to be used and modify the fill use plan, it's important to provide that information to the department. Okay, next slide. I think we are breaking for questions.
We are. Thank you so much, Neil. We have a few questions here and a little bit of time to cover some questions. I believe the questions are mostly for Greg. So Greg, if you want to come on camera. There's a question, who do we contact for the pre-approval process in step 1? Conference call with DEP is the person asking the question. Are they supposed to call the department or? Greg Newman, are you out there?
I'm back.
Okay, thank you. Who do we contact for pre-approval process for step 1?
Yeah, so on the SRP webpage, it lists guidance contacts. I'm listed, so my email and phone number are provided right there on that webpage.
All right, great, thank you. The next question is rather lengthy, but the bottom line is it gets to the department's position on using professional judgment with compliance averaging, which I believe is covered later in the presentation. Is that correct?
Yeah, so
okay.
We're going to cover that in some more detail.
Okay, so I'm going to bypass that. This is also covered later in the presentation. At a historic fill site where contamination is assumed to consist of historic fill compounds, can historic fill material be moved from one area of the site to another without characterization? Will that be covered later? Or?
We will cover that, and I think the easy answer is yes, provided that's within the same AOC.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question that we seem, there's another one. One of the slides said a fill plan is needed for clean fill.
Yes, it is, as per the tech regs.
Okay, thank you. With regard to changes in topography requiring NJDEP approval for alt fill use, how stringent are the topography change requirements? Does the topography need to remain exactly the same with a survey required?
I mean, I think the answer, if the question's related to the pre-approval process, if you're importing fill and raising it above the pre-remediation topography, then you have to seek pre-approval from the department prior to importation. In terms of the ultimate grading of the site, when using that to support the development, that's going to be site specific, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Okay, thank you. Would an approved site-specific materials acceptance plan act as a pre-approval?
I think that gets back to the grandfathering issue with the change in the standards. And I think that gets back to the issue of when a remedial action work plan is approved, there's a timeline for implementing that ties back to ARCs. And it would depend on whether or not that remedial action work plan has been implemented within that time frame.
Okay. Right now, I'm going to stop taking questions so we can stay on target with our agenda. And next slide, we're going to go to a 10-minute break. We'll have time for more questions later in the presentation. So it's 9:40. We'll be back at 9:50 to begin the next presentation.
Okay, everyone, it is about 9:50, so we are going to get started again. Up next, we have Roger Ferguson. So Roger, if you're ready, you can take it away.
Thank you. Good morning again, everyone. Hope everybody's well after the mayhem yesterday. It's a fun way to spend a birthday, chopping up trees and liberating cars that have been crushed and all that stuff. I'm going to talk about doing the data evaluation for your receiving site. This is the key component of your fill use plan. So next slide, please, Tyrone. So if you're moving material on site or you're bringing alternate fill in from off site, you have to do a determination of what is the maximum concentration of the material that we can bring in on the site, or that we can move on our site. So this is going to be based on your remedial investigation sampling data. Maybe you need to go get more data in order to support what you're working on. It's going to depend on the size of your AOC, or is in fact your AOC the entire site in the case of historic fill material. But these should be grab samples. These are going to be, your traditional, hey, we saw a spot on the ground, so we sampled it, and then we fanned out around it to delineate it to the applicable standard or screening level. These will all be grab samples. Okay? There's additional guidance on use of composite samples that we'll talk about later. Statistically, when you look at these, and we'll get more into this in a little bit, that our data is going to 99% of the time be a non-parametric data set, meaning there is no measurable pattern of distribution statistically. Okay? It's not going to be a normal bell curve type of data set. Next slide, please, Tyrone. When we handle our data, okay, we need to, there needs to be some level of consistency. You can refer to the compliance attainment guidance for how to do averaging and do the calculations. What do you do with your non-detect data? Do you use a 0? Okay. Do you use half the method detection limit? Whatever you do, you have to be consistent. Okay. And Appendix A of this guidance document, we'll talk about the 95th percent upper confidence level of the mean, which has a few more thoughts in it. Next slide, please. So, in the rule, which was originally in the original guidance back in 2012, been at this a long time, and then we put this into, I should say the department put this into the rule in August of 2018, is a requirement to use the 75th percentile as the default maximum of any contaminant that you bring onto an alternative fill situation. So in the guidance, there was an example. We show the concentrations of 8 samples on the left. And there's a number of ways you can do this, but our friend Microsoft Excel has a function built right in. You specify the range, you specify the 75th percentile, and Viola, you get an answer of 32. Notice in this particular case, the mean would be 93 milligrams per kilogram. And with any calculation, you always do rounding to the applicable number of significant digits after the calculation, not before. Next slide, please. So that's the easy one. However, in the guidance, and this was in the original guidance and is carried through to this day, we have written about using a more robust statistical calculation known as the 95th percent upper confidence limit of the mean, or the 95th UCL, simply. And if you're familiar with the risk assessment process, this is very commonly used to determine the maximum reasonable exposure level for federal projects under the Superfund paradigm. What is the likely worst case exposure that someone could have for the whole area? Okay. This option requires DEP pre-approval. Okay, this is a variance from the regulation. You would cite in your key document, we varied from the rule, we submitted this to DEP as part of a fill use plan, and then we got written approval later. And written approval means you got something back from Greg saying, your fill use plan has been approved. It does not mean it was reviewed when you're looking at your comprehensive reporting data miner. Those are two very different things. And there's been a few board decisions on that. Next slide, please, Tyra. So how do you do this? There's a free program out there called ProUCL. It was written for UCL, written for US EPA. Version 5.1 is still the most current. You can import your data from an Excel spreadsheet directly, or you can copy or paste your RI data into the program. I'll show you what the screen looks like in a second. There are some limitations on the number of discrete results that you have. Typically, you should have more than 20 samples, but the program will run with less than that. Okay? Again, so if you're going to have less than 20 samples, you need to support that with your professional judgment as to why that works. Okay? Pro-UCL handles non-detect data, i.e. data that's below the method detection limit. It's not incorporated into the example we're going to have here, but there is a way to do this. You're not just left censoring it, and you're not just putting in 0. And Pro-UCL does a bunch of other cool stuff too. It actually will do the Mann-Kendall calculations for you. It has a whole bunch of other features in it that when you delve into it, it's like good stuff. And best yet, it's free. So, next slide, please. So, in our data set in the example, we have 56 data points. We're working with our friend here, a compound known as tetramethyl DEF. It's not a real compound. I couldn't tell you what the standard is, but these are the numbers. There are no non-detected data in this data set. Kind of simplifies that part a little bit. Next slide, please. So in Pro-UCL, you would paste your data or import your data arranged in a column. You could have a column that actually has the sample IDs on it if you want. Each column can be labeled so you can keep track of which compound you're just talking about. So this would be, our friend tetramethyl DEF here again. If you're using the option to handle non-detect data, you would put a 0 or 1 in the next column, and anything that's a 0 is non-detected, you would put the actual method detection limit over into that column. It takes a little more fine-tuning by hand. Again, it's not required in our data set. To run Pro-UCL for determining the 95th UCL, the first thing that the department wants you to do is to run the statistical tests. Okay? Always when we run UCL, we're going to put it in full precision mode. That actually has no impact on the processing speed anymore. And then you pull from the statistical test and hit the outliers drop-down box. When it comes time to run the UCLs, you pull from the UCL EPCs, and they run all. And I'll come back to that in a second. Next slide, please, Tara. So for our sample data set, this is the output when you run the outlier test. This is a Rosner's outlier test. For those of you who took statistics in college, and it still brings back wonderful memories. Here you go. Okay. At a 5% confidence level, again, we're working at the 95th% confidence level, so a 5% significance is what we're going to use. It tells us that 359, the highest data of that set, was an statistical outlier. So you would remove that point and then rerun the data. And in this particular example, you would remove the 256, the 134, which there were 2 results, 115, 110, and 75.9 all get removed as statistical outliers. Next slide, please, Tara. So after doing all of that, then you come back and run the upper confidence level. And I said again, run all of the UCL statistics. There are, I've lost count of how many different calculation options there are in Pro-UCL. One of the things that I find when we ran this particular example, after removing the outliers, this was a normal distribution. Byron, you can go to the next slide, please. Okay. This is kind of the cut to the chase, is that this was the data appears approximate normal at the 95th% confidence level, and as a result, it recommends the 95th% students T-test UCL, and the result is 22. Again, this doesn't do any rounding for you. You have to do that to the appropriate number of significant digits after the fact. Okay. If you were to have run this data without removing the statistical outliers, the result would have been around 70 parts per million. So it's a significant difference in what you're going to be bringing onto the site. If you're going to propose not removing the outliers, you need to discuss that with DEP and in your fill use plan as to why, in your professional judgment, that is appropriate, and be able to support the statistics for that. Okay. Next slide, please, Tara. And I think we're holding off questions till a little bit later in the presentation.
Yeah, I was going to say there aren't any questions for this segment right now, so I think we can just go right into the next portion. So Amanda, if you're ready, you can take it away.
Let's just make sure everything is working. Okay. Everybody can hear me?
I can hear you and I can see you.
Perfect. Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Amanda Gettelfinger, and I am a research scientist in the Bureau of Environmental Evaluation and Risk Assessment here at DEP, along with Greg and Mila. And I will be continuing on the topic of alternative fill from offsite sources. Next slide, please. Sampling at the donor AOC. The purpose of sampling at the donor site or in the donor AOC is to fully characterize and understand the disposition of fill material. As detailed in the guidance, alternative fill donor material may come from in-state or out-of-state sources, and the sampling procedures for both types of sources are the same. Additionally, for both types of sources, should sufficient characterization data exist, like data contained in a remedial investigation or a remedial action report, sampling may not necessarily be required. Next slide, please. Characterization. The sampling frequency is determined by the volume of material being proposed for import to the site, and sampling frequencies are independent for each source of donor material. So that means if there is a situation where two individual sites are being proposed for alternative fill importation, then the sampling frequencies should be associated with each individual site's volume. Additionally, if donor material is being proposed for use and is from the same site but in different AOCs, then the volumes should be evaluated individually. Samples should be collected from areas of highest known concentrations of contaminants in the AOC, and if it is not known, random sampling can be employed for characterization. Lastly, samples should be collected to adequately represent the entire volume. In the case of a waste pile, as an example, the investigator should collect samples both from the surface of the pile and the interior of the pile. And in the case of in situ material, the investigator should collect samples from the surface and from the subsurface to a depth that would encompass the proposed volume of donor material. Next slide, please. Sampling frequency modifications. So there are two sampling frequencies listed in Table 1 of the guidance. The first frequency is the default sampling scheme, and that's generally used for donor material with little or no prior characterization data. The other is the reduced sampling scheme, which can be used when there has been some prior assessment of the fill source, such as through a PASI, an RI, or an RA. Just note that justification for the reduced frequency is required. And at the bottom of the slide here, we have a note that further reductions beyond the reduced frequency are permitted, but that they do require adequate justification or adequate technical justification, and that consultation with the department prior to fill importation is highly recommended. Next slide, please. Analytical requirement modifications. The guidance document details that the default analytical requirements for donor material is the TAL TCL plus 30 with EPH. This is the scheme that should be used if there is little to no prior existing data for the donor material or for the site. However, modifications to the default analyte list can be made if there is existing data, and modifications to the default analytical scheme do require technical justification. Just note that the more data that exists for an AOC or a site, the better justification for a modified analytical parameter set. Like with modifications to the sampling frequency, examples of when modifications may be made to analytical requirements are when there has been a PA or a site review, or if there is existing data from an SI, an RI, or from the Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology. It's just a note that all other requirements of the tech regs and the guidance still need to be met. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move into the discussion of composite sampling. The guidance details situations when composite data may be used to aid in characterization of donor material. The first instance is when the composite data is for dredged material obtained to support the Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology, and the dredged material is being proposed as alternative fill. Just note that supplemental data may be needed for the dredged material to meet the requirements of the fill guidance, including sampling frequency, additional analytical parameters, or additional discrete sampling. Composite data may also be used as a supplement to discrete sampling requirements or to reduce the quantity of discrete samples required to characterize the fill. The use of the composite data is frequently proposed by investigators in situations where proposed donor material from a site is relatively homogeneous and composite samples are far less likely to mask hotspot exceedances. Next slide, please. Okay, provisions for the use of composite data. So this portion of the guidance is new to this iteration of the guidance document, and these provisions were developed to allow for more flexibility in the use of composite sampling. The first is that a minimum of 70% of donor material volume should be characterized using discrete sampling per Table 1, which I will go over a little bit more in a few slides. The second is that the volume of donor material that a composite sample represents should not exceed a volume greater than 5 times the discrete sample volume per Table 1, and I will go over that a little bit more as well. The third is that composite samples should not be comprised of more than 5 discrete subsamples of equal sample weight. That one's pretty self-explanatory. The department will accept composite samples comprised of 2 to 5 subsamples. Next slide, please. The fourth is that composite sampling should be implemented such that samples are collected throughout the donor material to ensure the entire volume is adequately characterized. And I've already gone over this idea in the previous slides. Composite subsamples should be collected both at the surface and in the subsurface of the volume of material that it will represent. The fifth is that donor site composite sampling data should be compared to the receiving AOC's arithmetic mean and not the 75th percentile. And that is because a composite sample is an average of the values of the subsamples. And the results of the composite sampling should thus be compared to the averages of receiving AOC contaminants. Next slide, please. And the last provision is that if the composite data for a specific volume of donor material exceeds the applicable acceptance criteria, then the entire volume of donor material associated with the composite sample should be rejected for use at the receiving AOC. So because a sample is homogenized prior to being sent to the lab or at the lab, it is impossible to distinguish which sampling point or points the exceedances came from, so the entire volume must be eliminated for consideration as donor fill. And as stated on this slide at the bottom, Appendix D, which is new to this iteration of the guidance, provides a detailed example of an application of the provisions for composite sampling. And I'll go over Appendix D in the next few slides. Next slide, please. Considerations for the use of composite data. These considerations shouldn't be surprising or difficult to comply with. So the first is that the donor site or AOC should be well characterized, which I've already discussed. The second is that a scaled site plan of composite sample locations should be included in the fill use plan, which is also a requirement in the checklist of Appendix B for fill use plan contents. The next is that sampling methodologies should be in accordance with the Field Sampling Procedures Manual, and data should be of known quality. And the last is that composite samples are not acceptable for VOC characterization due to the loss of VOCs during homogenization. Next slide, please. Okay. So as I briefly introduced before, there is a new appendix to this version of the guidance document, and that's Appendix D. The committee added Appendix D to provide an example of how to apply composite sampling at a donor AOC. So I'm going to go over quickly how to apply the sampling guidelines here for reference. In this sample, a 10,000 cubic yard pile is being characterized to determine if it's suitable for use as donor fill. The site that it's coming from has been previously well characterized in this example. Per table 1 of the guidance, the default sampling scheme for a 10,000 cubic yard pile or volume is 24 discrete samples. But because this pile is coming from a site that is well characterized, the investigator is proposing a reduced sampling scheme. So to characterize the pile for importation, per the provisions, at least 70% of the samples should be discrete, which would reduce the default frequency from 24 to 16 discrete samples. And these 16 samples would represent, at minimum, 70% of the total volume. And then composite sampling can be employed to characterize the remaining 30% of the volume. So next slide, please. In our figure provided here, the yellow area of the diagram represents 70% of the, or 7,000 cubic yards of the stockpile. And the blue area represents the remaining 30% or 3,000 cubic yards of the stockpile. So there are 16 discrete samples that are represented by red dots, and they are used to characterize the 7,000 cubic yards of the stockpile material. And then 2 composite samples represented by the blue dots are used to characterize the other 3,000 cubic yards. Next slide, please. So as was previously stated in the provisions for the use of composite sampling, no subsample should represent more than a discrete sample. In a default sampling scheme using 24 samples to characterize 10,000 cubic yards, each sample would wind up representing approximately 416 cubic yards. So a composite sample should not represent, a composite subsample should not represent more than 416 cubic yards. In a 5-point compositing scenario like the one shown here, each of the composite samples would then represent 2,080 cubic yards. So for a 3,000 cubic yard portion of a pile, two composite samples would be needed. Next slide, please. And as a reminder, composite data should be compared to the receiving AOC's mean because a composite sample is an average. Additionally, if a composite sample exceeds the receiving AOC's mean for a given contaminant, the volume that is represented by that composite sample must be eliminated for consideration as donor fill. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to quickly move into the migration of groundwater and surface water evaluation for offsite sources. Next slide, please. So if analytical results of donor material demonstrate that material constituents do not exceed their soil remediation standards for the migration of groundwater pathway, then no further evaluation is required and the fill may be used as long as it is in compliance with other standards, criteria, and screening levels. Next slide, please. Conversely, if the analytical results from the donor material exceed the migration of groundwater standards, then the material should be evaluated using the synthetic precipitation leaching procedure for the MGW pathway. Because the material is being proposed for removal from one site and placement on another, in situ evaluations like sea soil and the immobile chemicals methodologies are not applicable. And the investigator should note that the use of SPLP generates a site-specific alternative remediation standard, so the submission of an ARS form will be required. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder that the finding of no groundwater contamination at the donor AOC or the donor site cannot be used as the sole basis for assuming that there is no potential for the migration of groundwater at the receiving AOC. And also because alternative fill is frequently placed above the water table in the receiving AOC, the migration to groundwater evaluation for donor materials should be applied to both the saturated and unsaturated zones in the donor AOC. And then next slide, please. On this particular slide, I have listed both the links for the alternative remediation standards tech guidance, where there are details on how to use SPLP, and also the alternative remediation standard application form that will need to be submitted. And next slide. Okay, I am going to briefly begin the discussion of specific materials considerations, but I will keep it very short and sweet. So next slide, please. PCBs in alternative fill. Per the coordination of NJDEP and US EPA PCB remediation policies document, which is a bit of a mouthful, importation of fill material with PCBs exceeding 1 milligram per kilogram is prohibited. This is not explicitly defined in the Toxic Substances Control Act, but has been agreed upon by both NJDEP and US EPA. However, the on-site movement of PCB material greater than 1 milligram per kilogram between AOCs is acceptable per the like-on-like and 75th percentile requirements detailed in the guidance that Greg was explaining earlier. Next slide, please. PCBs in crushed concrete for on-site reuse must meet the like-on-like and 75th percentile requirements, and TSCA requirements apply to concentrations exceeding 1 milligram per kilogram. Previously, a beneficial use determination was required to use crushed concrete with contaminants above their most stringent remediation standards as alternative fill. In this version of the guidance detailed in section 3.9, that has changed, and the use of contaminated crushed concrete is per LSRP discretion, as long as it meets the like-on-like and the 75th percentile requirements. And Anthony Fontana from the department is going to touch on that a little bit more later on in this training. Next slide, please. And a poll question.
Yeah, I'm here to ask the poll question. So you'll have 1 minute. TSCA requirements apply to concentrations of PCBs greater than A, 10 milligrams per kilogram, B, 1 milligram per kilogram, C, 3 milligrams per kilogram, or D, 20 milligrams per kilogram. So while I have a few moments to waste, I just want to let everybody know that if you missed the first poll question, there are still 2 more after this one. You need to answer a total of 3 out of 4 to receive your continuing education credits. Also, there was a question about slides for this presentation. They'll be posted to the SRP training page in the coming weeks. That's where we put all of our training materials, so there will be something specific to this guidance. And actually, this entire presentation, the slides and handout, will be posted for your use. So it looks like almost everybody has answered. It's just a few more seconds. Okay, poll is closed. Amanda, you can continue.
Okay. B, 1 milligram per kilogram is when TSCA requirements apply to PCBs greater or at the site. Next slide, please, Tyrone. Okay, I'm going to quickly wrap things up here. Other issues related to PCBs. So for PCBs and alternative film material proposed for on-site movement that exceed 50 milligrams per kilogram, please contact the department for guidance. The use of this material is usually made on a case-by-case basis. You can either contact me or Kevin Schick as the PCB lead contact for LSRPs. Additionally, the TSCA trigger for PCBs as bulk remediation waste is 1 milligram per kilogram. And so if PCBs at the site exceed 1 milligram per kilogram from a post-1978 discharge, or are greater than 50 milligrams per kilogram from any discharge, then TSCA is applicable. And please feel free to consult with the department on any of these sorts of cases as well. Next slide, please. And I guess we're moving on to questions.
Yeah, we have a few questions, so I'll briefly ask some of them. Is there a specific outlier test that should be conducted?
Roger, that one's for you.
Is it? I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Or for anybody else who feels like they want to jump in.
Anybody out there? All right, I'm going to go to the next question. It seems, oh boy, hold on. Before I read that, I have to skim that. Is the PCB trigger of 1 milligram per kilogram on a per arc-lure basis or total arc-lures?
Total arc-lures.
If you sample a site using the discrete sampling requirements for 10,000 yards and you need to go back and characterize another 5,000 yards, can you rely on composite samples only for this additional material?
That's an interesting question. I think it would be dependent on whether the 5,000 cubic yards came from the same AOC as the first 10,000 cubic yards. If they are from different AOCs, then discrete sampling would be highly recommended. And in the case that it is from the same AOC, with adequate technical justification, it might be deemed appropriate to use composite sampling if the film material is homogeneous in nature.
Does SPLP need to be done for historic fill-related constituents that are already present in groundwater?
I'm going to defer that question to Greg, if he's available.
Yeah, I'm here. I mean, that's really more related to historic fill and whether or not that historic fill is impacting groundwater. One might conduct SPLP to determine if that material and the exceedances in groundwater are due to historic fill, but I believe that you can establish CEAs for historic fill that is impacting groundwater. So that's really a site-specific decision and really doesn't involve really isn't pertinent to the fill guidance document per se.
All right, thanks, Greg. So Nick Huzar is here, and he had a question earlier about PCBs, but I didn't ask the question because it wasn't relevant. So I'm going to ask it now. Are PCBs considered a historic fill contaminant?
That's sort of a complicated answer. To a certain degree, they can be associated with historic fill at lower levels. Typically, the department does not recognize PCBs in excess of about 10 milligrams per kilogram as a historic fill related contaminant. But with that said, if they are distributed in similar concentration ubiquitously across the site, and even if there's supporting documentation from adjacent sites, it could be the argument could be made that they are at low levels related to historic fill.
All right, I'm going to take one more question and then we'll move on. For implementing PCB delineation and cleanup under LSRP directive, does a PRCR need department approval?
Could you ask that again?
For implementing?
No, not for delineating PCBs.
Okay. All right.
There you go.
Thank you very, very much, Amanda. And we are going to move on to the next presentation. Anthony?
Good morning. My name is Anthony Fontana, and I'm with the Bureau of Solid Waste Permitting. And this morning, I'll talk to you about some recent changes to the A901 licensing requirements and who is required to have one, along with when you would need a beneficial use determination approval or an acceptable use determination approval if you're importing materials to your site. Okay, next slide. First off, what is an A901 license? An A901 license was designed for the solid waste or hazardous waste industry. If you're engaged in those industries, you need this license, and it's designed to keep organized crime and environmental criminals out of the industry. So it includes a background statement and whatnot. However, when the Dirty Dirt law got passed a couple of years ago, it expanded who is required to need an A901 license. So it went beyond those in the waste industry. And it cast a very broad net, broader than I think we would like it to. We certainly didn't want to capture small landscapers and pool companies. And for today's audience, I think you'll be happy to know we're trying not to include licensed site remediation professionals as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. Now, there's a lot of gray areas with this law, and the department is developing regulations regarding this law and working on who may be exempt from the law. And on our website, on the slide, you can go to our website, and there is guidance and frequently asked questions about this law. I'm not going to be able to answer any specific questions about it because there is on our website how to ask questions, because these are being evaluated by a committee and trying to answer them. Okay, next slide, please. And this slide came out of what's in the guidance and frequently asked questions. So it's saying that as long as you're a LSRP or a certified subsurface evaluator, and you're retained to provide those services, as long as you're working as an LSRP or an evaluator, that you will not need an A901 license to do that work. Next slide. And this slide, there was a change in this most recent field guidance document. Under the old field guidance document, it said if you were importing soil and it met the like on like in the 75th percentile, that you did not need to come to the solid waste program to get a beneficial use determination. In this guidance, we've expanded that to include not only soil, but other materials that are traditionally used as fill, such as soil, concrete, brick, and block. So as long as it meets the definition of fill materials in the Dirty Dirt law, then you do not need to come to the solid waste program to get a beneficial use determination approval. However, if it does exceed, if it doesn't meet the definition of one of those types of material and it exceeds the remediation standards, then you would have to come to the solid waste program to get a BUD approval. Next slide. Now, dredge materials from coastal New Jersey waters are by definition not solid waste. However, they're still regulated by the department under the department's Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology. So if you're looking to import dredge material or process dredge material, it doesn't require a BUD from solid waste, but you do have to go to our Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology to get an acceptable use determination from them. And that's all I have for you this morning.
All right, thank you so much, Anthony. Up next, we have Myla Ramirez. So Myla, if you're ready. All right, yep. Perfect.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Myla Ramirez. I work in the Bureau of Environmental Evaluation and Risk Assessment, and I'll just be giving really quick summaries on some material consideration topics. So next slide, please. So continuing the discussion on material consideration for alternative fill. So under record waste, only non-hazardous material can be used at a receiving AOC. Use of hazardous waste fill material is prohibited according to NJAC 726E 5.2F, and a variance is not allowed. When contaminant concentrations are substantially elevated, TCLP may be necessary for evaluation and determination. Now, for dredge material, including processed dredge material, it is evaluated the same way as other fill sources, meaning it is subject to sampling, data comparison, the same way as soil material. Data for evaluation can be used from a completed SIRI and or NJDP's Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology, but sometimes this isn't comprehensive enough compared to the sampling frequency laid out in Table 1, so further supplemental sampling and analysis may be needed. I also want to stress with processed dredge material that additives that were used may also be a source of contamination that needs to be assessed in addition to whatever contaminants are present in the material. So if you obtain bench scale data for PDM from ODST, then the investigator should evaluate the data to determine if it's sufficient to meet this technical guidance. If you have any concerns that it's not representative or the sampling frequency is inadequate, or even if you want to ensure compliance with the applicable remediation standards, then discrete samples of the actual PDM may be necessary. Next slide, please. So moving on to historic fill. So historic fill may be used as alternative fill, but I'd like to stress that full characterization is needed. Oftentimes, historic fill is laid over large parts of your site, if not all. And a common approach is to have gridded samples over this large area. So if you plan to use historic fill, it is subject to the sampling frequencies listed in Table 1. Now for MGW evaluation, it is needed if the donor AOC has contaminated groundwater, and SPLP may be needed to confirm if contaminant concentrations are high. And with dioxin, I just want to mention that dioxin sampling is only required if your donor material is suspected to be contaminated with dioxins, and that includes the site, the donor AOC, and even within its migration pathway. And if you have any questions on dioxin, please feel free to reach out to me. Next slide. That's it for my end.
All right, thanks, Mila. Our next presenter is Brian Montag. Brian, looks like you're ready to go.
I am. Good morning. Brian Montag, I'm with K&L Gates. So I'm going to just make a few brief points on the use of asphalt millings, and that's section 4.7.9 of the guidance. And there's a number of permitted uses for asphalt millings, and we're talking about millings from roadway removal primarily, which are permitted at SRP sites. And we know quarry and road construction industry has an abundance, in fact, an overabundance really of this material located at quarries and a range of locations around the state and available for recycling. So there are some presumptive uses that'd be without the need for permit applications or approvals from the department to obtain and use the material as fill and for construction support. So here's just a quick overview, as I said. We could go to the next slide, please. Okay. So as an initial matter, any use of asphalt millings under the guidance for SRP sites must be in an area which is defined as an AOC. If you have an AOC, then there are a few categories of permitted uses listed here. The first type is use in the guidance as an engineering control, namely the use of asphalt millings that are permitted as a component of engineering in two circumstances. First, as a sub-base aggregate, that could be under roads, parking lots, or building slab foundations or sidewalks. This is consistent with many road applications, and the general rule is to apply standard engineering design specifications for your use of the material. Second, asphalt millings can be used as an unbound surfacing material if an appropriate additive is utilized to stabilize and contain the asphalt milling. And that is, this applies when we say unbound surfacing material. This is asphalt, which is in a loose type gravel form, good to be used on, we could use that on parking lot or other surfaces. The key is to use an additive which will help stabilize and contain the millings. This is so to help prevent it from moving into non-AOC areas of the SRP site. And some examples of those additives are things like there's foaming, bitumen, emulsions, and cementitious materials. And the next type of use is simply using the asphalt milling as an alternative fill material, but then you're looking at providing like-on-like 75th percentile and conducting an W evaluation, and much of that has been covered as part of Section 4. Next slide, please. Okay. So, burning question is, you're all no doubt wondering, can you use it on non-AOC areas of the site? And the answer is yes, at least in certain circumstances. And I get that that's not really a burning question. But what are those circumstances? Well, in 2018, the New Jersey legislature passed the Recycling Asphalt Pavement legislation, or RAP legislation. And I'll give you a cite for that. It's NJSA 13:1E-99.28A. But RAP is just a fancier way of really saying asphalt millings, which are specifically intended for recycling use. They're really just asphalt millings, either way you look at it. And a footnote here that the RAP legislation was based on a study that was commissioned by the NJDOT to expand recycling uses of RAP. That was in 2017, conducted by Rowan University, Columbia, and Stony Brook. And it provides a lot of technical background. And I just put that out there if you wanted to see the background for its use and the presumptive nature of it. But the findings of that report are generally that the RAP, or asphalt millings, do not leach into soil or groundwater. And obviously there's a lot of findings around that. And I would urge you to just look at the underlying report, which is searchable on the DOT website. So specifically, the RAP legislation identifies a range of uses, including using RAP or asphalt millings in bedrock quarry reclamation, as base, subbase, and surface materials. And that would include underneath a guardrail of a public road or highway, or as a surface material for a parking lot, farm road, or pathway. So as long as you're using RAP or asphalt millings consistent with these type of presumptive uses under the RAP legislation, then you can use it in a non-AOC area at the site. And finally, I would just say that uses of asphalt millings that are outside of the purview of the site remediation program, but do not meet the standards specified in the RAP legislation, or that would be subject to review by the department's Division of Sustainable Waste Management. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm going to open up to questions now. So if you have any questions for Brian, Mila, or Anthony, you can put them into the box. The first question is SPLP analysis considered ARS? Can you clarify on that?
Hi, this is Amanda. Yes, if the use of SPLP would create an alternative remediation standard, and because of the creation of that alternative remediation standard for that material, then an ARS form should be submitted.
Okay, and the next question, this one's a little bit long, so bear with me just because the chat box can be a little bit strange on my end. Section 3.9 of the fill guidance allows an LSRP to approve the use of soil and fill recyclable material as defined in the dirty dirt law. The definition provided in the dirty dirt law states that soil and fill recyclable material shall not include 3 beneficial use materials for which the generator has obtained prior approval from the department to transport to an approved and designated destination. Can an LSRP approve the use of these materials if the CAO/BUD has expired?
Geez, I wish, I hate to say, can you reread that? I got
know,
lost on it.
Yeah, it's very long. Let me see. Yeah, we might have to just move on from that one. It's really long and the box is really small, so it's very difficult for me to read it easily. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. Within waste flow counties, is a BUD required for the RAP to be shipped out of county for recycling purposes?
Well, waste flow will only apply to waste. If it's not a waste, like if it's being beneficially reused or anything, it's not a waste, so waste flow would not apply.
Okay. I'm just skimming for any more questions. And just remember, if your question is not answered right now, it could be site specific. It could just be not great for this platform. So you will get the answer to the question. It looks like we have one more question. Wouldn't the use of recycled asphalt as an engineering control or outside of the SRP introduce PAH contaminants to the area?
Yeah, I could answer that. That was my reference to the NJDOT study that had concluded that the material actually does not leach. So, you know, I would reference that, and that was really the underlying study that allowed for that RAP legislation.
Okay, so I think right now that is all the questions that we have time to answer. We are going to go into a break. So we're a little bit ahead of schedule. We're still going to take a 10-minute break. I have 10:42 right now, so we are going to take a break until 10:52, and we'll see you then.
Okay, I'm going to bring us back from break. It's 10:52. Myla, there you are. All right, go ahead.
Great, so welcome back from break, everyone. So I'm back on to talk about the on-site movement of alternative fill. Next slide. So if you've thumbed through the fill guidance already, you'll notice that some elements are repetitive through the off-site, on-site, and clean fill sections. And rather than just repeat what's already been said and making this training twice as long, I'm just going to highlight some identical parts. So in regards to sampling, for the default sampling scheme, reduced sampling frequency with justification, composite sampling, these are identical from the offsite section to the onsite. Additionally, material considerations, that is also identical for onsite sources of fill. And moving our discussion to on-site movement of alternative fill, I think in general there are two buckets that I would group your decisions to, and they are movement without pre-approval and with pre-approval. So next slide, please. So the first bucket that we're going to talk about is movement of on-site alternative fill without pre-approval. So pursuant to NJAC 726E 5.2 D1, alternative fill from an on-site source may be moved without prior written approval from the department, provided that the individual contaminants present in both the alternative fill and receiving area of concern at concentrations above applicable remediation standards. That's a mouthful. That is all to summarize that if like on like is being met on site, then you do not need to come in for a pre-approval. Again, if you are meeting like on like, you do not need a pre-approval. And so the department will allow exceptions to the 75th percentile requirement if all of the four of the following requirements are met. So consolidation or movement of your alternative fill on site will not result in or increase of groundwater contamination. It will not result in creation of a VI pathway, and your alt fill does not contain hazardous waste or contain any free liquid. So again, if you're meeting like on like, you do not need to come in for pre-approval, and you do not need to follow the 75th percentile requirement as long as these four conditions are being met. Next slide. And a poll question.
All right, so this is our third poll question for today's training. It is another true or false. The department will allow exceptions to the 75th percentile requirement as long as four requirements are met. True or false? So the poll question should come up and you can select your answer on there. Please make sure you do not post it into the chat box or into the question box, or else it won't count. And just a reminder, Christina just put the SurveyMonkey link in the chat, so feel free to open that up and take a look, and make sure you fill that out by the end of this training. It really helps us gather information on what we could make more effective and impactful for all of you. So it looks like almost everyone voted. Just make sure you're getting those answers in. You have like 10 more seconds. Just a few more seconds, and then the poll is going to close out. So it looks like most of you voted. Next slide, please. The answer is true, and it looks like most of you got that correct. So Mila, back to you.
Thanks. Just going to reiterate, so the answer is true as long as like-on-like is being met. So we're already on the next slide. So what are the conditions that require a pre-approval? So obviously, based on the last slide, if you are not meeting like-on-like, you do need to come in for a pre-approval. And another overall concept that I want to stress is that movement of alternative fill to a clean area is prohibited. So this constitutes a new discharge, and I think this really echoes the guidance document's overall intent that we do not want to make a site worse. And so again, you cannot move alternative fill or any contaminated material to a clean area for on-site. The department may allow on-site movement exceptions to the like-on-like and 75th percentile with a pre-approval, like I just mentioned, and technical justification is required for that according to NJAC 726E 5.2 D2. So we may allow exceptions to the like-on-like and 75th percentile if the prior 4 requirements for without pre-approval are met, so those 4 requirements in the past slides, with the additional 2 considerations. That a clean area is created that meets both residential ingestion dermal inhalation and migration to groundwater standards at the donor AOC by the movement of alt fill to the receiving area of concern, and the requirement that total area of contamination is reduced by 25% in the areal extent of contamination at the donor AOC. So again, if you do not have like-on-like or 75th percentile, and you come in for pre-approval, the movement of on-site alternative fill needs to meet those 4 requirements and additionally these 2. Next slide. So there are special cases involving historic fill where we do give special consideration for historic fill relocation across property lines. And these are mainly for large redevelopment projects that include multiple contiguous properties like brownfield redevelopment areas. And so if you're working on a project like this, it's much easier to discuss with us and rope us into it earlier, so please just reach out. So if you are planning to do this, keep in mind that sampling at both donor and receiving areas are required, and historic fill should be investigated at a sampling frequency of 4 samples per acre as outlined in the historic fill technical guidance. The on-site historic fill movement can be performed following that donor and receiving areas meet the like-on-like requirement. And again, if like-on-like is not met, you need to come in for a pre-approval. Another consideration is that it will not result in or increase groundwater contamination. The placement of historic fill is protective of public health, safety, and the environment, and that all historic fill at the site is remediated in accordance with the tech rules. Again, I just want to stress with this historic fill movement, it's very, very specific for brownfield redevelopment areas and moving historic fill across multiple contiguous properties. So if you're working on this or starting a project on it, please just come to us and talk to us about it. Next slide. Cool, so frequently asked questions. Can I deviate from the 75th percentile for on-site movement? I'm just going to reiterate it because I know you guys are, slammed with a bunch of information during these presentations. And I just want to, at least for this section of the presentation, just want to reiterate, you can deviate from the 75th percentile for on-site movement. You do not need a pre-approval if you're meeting the like-on-like. If you are not meeting the like-on-like, then the pre-approval is necessary, and you need to meet these 2 conditions below: the clean area and that the total areal extent of contamination is reduced by 25% at the donor AOC. Next slide. Great, so I will transition now to talking about clean fill. So overall, I don't think that we did a lot of updates to this clean fill section in this version, so it'll be relatively short. I do want to mention that the department highly recommends the use of clean fill at your remediation sites. Overall, using clean fill is much more straightforward, it's clean, and you don't have to worry about any pre-approval steps necessarily. So again, if you're able to use clean fill, we highly recommend it. Next slide. So I'm gonna just mention the definition according to 726E section 1.8. Clean fill means material to be used in a remedial action that meets all soil remediation standards, site-specific alternative standards, or site-specific interim standards, doesn't contain extraneous debris or solid waste, and does not contain free liquids. So this also includes any material that meets all criteria or action levels for contaminants without standards available on the department's website, and this material can be soil or non-soil. Next slide. So there are similar elements from the offsite section, the onsite section, and with clean fill too. So with sampling, we do recommend the default sampling, reduce sampling frequency with justification, and there's the opportunity to even do reduced and move off of the reduced sampling frequency, as well as composite sampling. I just want to mention with material considerations, obviously for the most part, it's clean material, but there are instances where there are elevated natural background throughout the state. And so for any of these contaminants that are above the remediation standards, like on like still applies. And so that's something you should be mindful of. And for migration to groundwater, an evaluation should not be needed because again, it's clean. But if donor material concentrations are above any of the applicable soil remediation standards for the migration to groundwater pathway, then an evaluation is needed. Next slide. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Mila. Up next, we have Brian Montag again. So Brian, whenever you're ready.
Great. Hello again. So we're going to briefly discuss quarry materials, which is section 7 of the guidance. And I think there's relatively straightforward procedures for accepting quarry materials at SRP sites. So let's go to the next slide, please. So here we go. First and foremost, certified quarry material may be relied upon for purposes of issuing an RAO without the need for sampling. And the guidance outlines certain conditions in order for an investigator to rely on a certification from a quarry operator. First, as noted here, the certification must be prepared by an authorized quarry or mine operator under applicable state law. So, for example, if it's a New Jersey quarry, then you should verify the quarry is approved by the New Jersey Department of Labor, and the Department of Labor approves quarry and mining operations under the New Jersey Mine Safety Act and related regulations. So it's verifiable. You can check on DOL's website, or they list a number of numbers listed in the guidance for that purpose. And if you go to Pennsylvania or New York, there's similar procedures. Just make sure you're dealing with a legitimate licensed quarry. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So next, the next condition you have to make sure is part of the certification that you receive is that the quarry is providing licensed material. And it's a relatively straightforward concept. It essentially is really saying that it needs to be virgin aggregate or quarry materials. And there's conditions listed here of the type of things that qualify as licensed, what you're looking for. And it listed undisturbed geologic formation, that it's not impacted by contaminant sources, it's not commingled, And the rest of these all relate to, is it contaminated? It's not known or suspected to be contaminated. It's not known to be impacted by hazardous materials. There's been no introduction of contaminants or any increase in the concentration of contaminants. So that's pretty standard requirement. Of course, you want to make sure you're really dealing with virgin aggregate material. Next slide, please. So next, in order to rely on the certification needs to actually indicate that the source of the delivered licensed quarry or mine material hasn't been subject to a discharge hazardous substance at any time. Again, consistent with the types of things has to be in a licensed material. So it's really just restating what is required. And then, of course, the guidance makes clear that if the aggregate or quarry material is from an unauthorized quarry, or it's one that has not provided a certification for the material, then the only means to use that material is by way of Section 6, and you have to demonstrate that it's clean fill under the tech rules, as you heard earlier today. Next slide, please. Okay. And finally, even if the quarry or mine material is certified, that does not preclude the investigator from testing the material. Testing is not a requirement, but if it is certified material, you can rely on a properly prepared certification. But of course, there's nothing precluding testing if you wish to go that route or there's some suspicion related to the material. And there is also basic documentation you are requested to keep here, including the description of the quantity and location of the quarry or mining material was obtained from, along with providing the underlying certification to the department. And you can include that with your remedial action report or other filings. So I think that's it. That's the basic requirements. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. I'm going to go to questions now, and it appears that we only have one. Please confirm that the department accepts material if it is from a quote-unquote licensed quarry. So I'm not sure who on the committee would like to answer that question, but if you could pop on.
So I think that goes to, Greg, you can take that if you like.
Yeah, I mean, regarding the question, it's really not that the department's accepting it, it's that the LSRP is relying on that certification. So, the department does not, approve these facilities or these certifications, but we do allow the LSRP to rely on them if he wants to import that material as clean fill. Brian, I don't know if you have any follow-up suggestions or comments.
No, I think that was right on point. Thanks, Greg.
Okay. That's the only question we have related to this set of topics. So I'm going to move on and introduce Neil. See, Neil, I'm going to go off camera and off you go.
Okay, very well. Thanks again, everyone. So I'm going to speak briefly about the fill use plan. One of the major changes in the guidance document was an extension and expansion of Appendix B, outlining the fill use plan submittal. The intent here was the department had identified a series of deficiencies over time in fill use plan submittals and felt that it was helpful to provide some additional information, some clarifications, and in fact, a checklist to help the regulated community to submit a plan that was clear and understandable and could more rapidly be approved. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with a public service announcement. Even though the guidance document was modified and published last October, the Appendix B has the additional information in it. The department continues to receive fill use plans that are well short of the requirements. and the department's expectations. So please help yourselves, help your client, take a look at Appendix B. The department is not going to review incomplete fill use plans. Just delay the process that way. Note that a fill use plan is not simply a materials acceptance protocol, and it's not just these are the concentrations we're going to accept. There's more to it than that. And finally, and we all know this, we've been doing this long enough, when you're departing from guidance, provide the technical rationale supporting the LSRP's application of professional judgment. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Appendix B is where the expanded discussion of the fill use plan is included. The appendix identifies the components of a fill use plan when you're using alternative fill, when you're using clean fill, when you're using quarry and mine material. As you can understand, I think, and appreciate, greater amount of information is expected when using alternative fill than clean fill or the quarry mine material. As I mentioned earlier, the document includes a submittal checklist. Make sure you check twice and have completed the full application, the fill use plan. If an item's not applicable, say so in the fill use plan. Otherwise, the department may just determine that your plan is incomplete, not recognizing the non-applicability. If information about the donor site is not known, that's understood. The fill market is dynamic. There are instances where materials may not be available, or the materials you plan to use are no longer available. So there's an understanding of that. Ultimately, the expectation is the fill use plan is going to characterize the general range of concentrations of the donor material that are going to be used to demonstrate the compliance with the regulatory requirements. And then the information specifically about the donor site can be provided in the remedial action report. Next slide, please. Thanks. So now I'm going to cover a few practice pointers and reminders summarizing some of the fill use plan components. Provide cut and fill calculations. As Greg talked about earlier, the importance of understanding whether additional fill is being brought to raise the grade above that which is necessary to conduct remediation is going to be evaluated through these types of calculations. So through that process, you're identifying and calculating the volume of alternative fill that may be needed, and you're demonstrating that the planned volume of fill is no greater than that needed for the remedial action. Next slide. Include grading plans depicting the current and planned final elevations of the sites. And on those grading plans, identify the FEMA 100-year flood elevation. Again, Greg talked about that earlier in terms of understanding the importation of fill above that level. So the grading plan should show that information, should show the FEMA 100-year flood level, and it also should clearly identify the boundaries of the receiving AOC. In some cases, the entire site might be the receiving AOC, but there may be smaller subsections of the site where the fill will be imported to, and so it's important that the information in the fill use plan identifies specific locations of those AOCs. Next slide, please. In the fill use plan, you need to demonstrate compliance with the like-on-like in the 75th percentile or 95% UCL criteria. So provide laboratory data and sorted spreadsheets. If your spreadsheets are structured in such a way that it's clear what the 75th percentile calculation is, what the maximum concentration in the donor material is, and those things are clearly lined up in some spreadsheets. It's just going to make the process that much faster for the department to review. It's been my experience, and I'm sure the department gets it all the time, that we always need these fill use plans approved quickly. And if you want if you want the department to be able to give you a quicker turnaround, make it easier for them. Also, of course, if you're providing this information and you had the information for the donor site, provide the information for the donor site. Next slide. So and Greg talked briefly about this. Consultation with a professional engineer is encouraged where it's needed. Now, we all understand that LSRPs commonly rely upon information from other professionals, particularly where the specific discipline is outside of their professional experience or education. Professional engineers can be incredibly important and valuable in developing the grading plans, establishing those drawings I described earlier, identifying the flood elevations. In sites where we're importing fill material, geotechnical suitability of that material is important. Will it compact and ultimately serve its intended purpose as the underlying subbase material for a cap, for example? Are there concerns about the stability of the material in slope areas? These are things that geotechnical engineers can provide input to. And finally, professional engineers can assist with the cap design. Is the cap itself going to be suitable for the future use? So consider the input that you can obtain from other disciplines, from other specialists in preparing your fill use plan. The next slide, please. And as I talked about earlier, it's important that you do provide the NJDEP with documentation evidencing that you complied with the public notification requirements. Again, I mentioned that earlier, whether it's a delivery receipt for the fill use plan that you submitted to the municipality, or some other form of documentation through a municipal resolution or similar. You want to make sure that that you provide that information as part of your fill use plan submission. And again, to notify the department in instances where the fill use plan needs to change due to the public input. I think that's my last slide, and we'll be shifting over to Roger and Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Neil.
Thank you.
Roger and Greg. Here's Roger.
Thank you. Okay, before we get into, we're going to talk about some common questions that we run into, but piggybacking on Neil's thoughts, it's appropriate that we talk about independent professional judgment and how it applies in these situations, because at the end of the day, there's lots of judgments that get made every step along the way. So next slide, Tara. I think everybody will remember that SARA 14C created the hierarchy of statute, regulation, department guidance, and other guidance. EPA, other states, certainly ITRC, all falls into that category. You should be very familiar with the board rules at section 6.3 of professional competency. Also rolls through these as well. You know, if you say, hey, I'm using DEP's guidance, explain it. If you're using something else, you have to explain it. Next slide, please. Document, document, document it again. Okay. SARA requires that, you know, discussions of any variance or deviations be in the next key document. So your submissions should include clear tables of contents and section headings. Okay. Detailed information. You know, you cannot assume that the reviewer knows your site. Okay. Those days are long, long gone. So, you know, include the details necessary. More details rather than less. Okay? Provide your multiple lines of evidence, and if there's exculpatory evidence, evidence that doesn't fit your hypothesis, you have to explain it, and you have to say why you're not relying upon that. And again, to help the reviewer, submit copies of your previous submittals or sections of those submittals if they're relevant to your conclusion. Okay? Somebody in BIR or Greg's group, they've got to go to the OPA process just like we do to get those old reports. So make it easy on them. Okay? Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Next ending component here of our presentation is designed to just present some common questions that the department gets, and what our response would be regarding these questions. Next slide, please. So, does the source of donor material have to be identified as a component of the fill use plan? And which, as you may remember, I indicated that has to be a component of an RAW. And, the answer is no, as Neil touched on earlier. The department understands that the availability of fill material varies from day to day, and that, you may get a raw approved in 2022, and you may not actually be needing that fill in terms of bringing it to the site until later. Could be several years later. However, what is required with that fill use plan is, again, the identification of the receiving AOC and the boundaries. What contaminants are present and what is their 75th percentile. You should be able to provide at that point volume estimates. What elevation is the final target relative to the 100-year floodplain, et cetera. These types of things do need to be submitted or documented in the fill use plan. As Roger just alluded to earlier, the sources of fill material and the final volumes, and the sampling data used to document that, to show compliance with the criteria, receiving criteria such as like on like and 75th, final as-built engineering plans, shipping manifests, etc. These should all be then submitted in the next key document submission, which is typically the remedial action report. Next slide, please. Okay, can off-site alternative fill be imported and utilized across an entire site? The answer to that question is yes, but you have to be a little careful here and remember that the fill guidance document is based on the importation of fill and its use at a specific receiving AOC. However, we often have sites that are, part of larger areas that were developed near river systems and whatnot that were filled, and it's not at all uncommon to have regional filling across many sites. So in that particular instance, the historic fill present across the entire site is an AOC. Another word of caution, what often happens with sites where it's acknowledged early on that historic fill is present across the entire site, sometimes that area isn't sampled as an area of concern or investigated per se. Oftentimes, during the PASI process, when historic fill is identified, maybe the SRP at the time thinks that they're just going to do the presumptive cap, which is fine. The problem what often happens though is that later on, maybe the site is going to be proposed for redevelopment and then alternative fill needs to be part of that. Well, then you don't have any sample data. And that's where people, tend to try and stretch the envelope a little bit or push the envelope rather. And maybe they only have 2 or 3 samples that they're trying to calculate 75th and like on like criteria, with across 10 acres of your site. And that's obviously not appropriate. So if you do have historic fill and you want to use that as a receiving AOC, make sure it's properly characterized and that the sampling is representative of the area. And you can consult the historic fill guidance document for those types of parameters and sampling frequencies. I think the next couple slides go back to Roger. So thank you.
Okay. Next slide, Tom. When evaluating topsoil data for a site, should the investigator use the May 2021 site remediation standards or the site-specific standards established in the RAW and the fill use plan, or something else entirely different? With the change in standards, the laboratories are generally all publishing the new numbers now when you get your data. But if you had a raw fill use plan submitted before November 17th, 2021, okay, that set the remediation standards for your site. Maybe you had site-specific migration of groundwater numbers as well. Those all got locked in. So those would be your acceptance criteria, your general acceptance requirements for your topsoil, your clean fill material. And just, a note about topsoil, it's a manufactured product generally, unless it's been stripped off of somebody's site. So sampling and analysis is almost always necessary. Next slide, please. Okay, another common question that I get, and I know Greg gets, when evaluating a source of clean fill, can averaging of sampling data be utilized for compliance with the remediation standards? For example, if an adequately characterized soil stockpile exhibits low-level exceedances, i.e. less than an order of magnitude above the standard of a compound, can this be averaged over the data set? And the department's position is averaging cannot be used to address the exceedances. Next slide. Soil sample results containing contaminants above the most stringent SRS, and the volumes of soil associated with those samples do not meet the definition of clean fill and should not be brought to the site. That material doesn't meet the definition of clean fill, or 1.8 that we had earlier, and therefore can't be brought to the site. Professional judgment can be used to determine which of the soil is clean or has exceedances, but not for averaging. I would suggest that this is a policy statement by the department, folks. This is not written in the guidance. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, Roger, and thank you, Greg. It looks like we have a couple of questions. The first one is, if you are removing/closing a typical UST requiring 4 to 5 truckloads of backfill, e.g. quarry gravel, do you need a fill use plan?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question would be yes. The tech rules at 5.2H requires the submission of a fill use plan when using alternative fill or clean fill. Now, obviously, regarding the example posed by the, this question here, it's not going to be what I would consider a robust fill plan. It can be very simple, but it does require that you document, how that clean fill was used and where, and what certifications were used to show that it was clean or sampling.
Underground storage tanks are closed at a site investigation phase generally, though. So I think you need to have a clear policy and written protocol for assuring that your quarry fill material is used as a backfill. Most of the times when tanks are pulled, there is not a raw on the table in practice, Greg.
It could be, but nonetheless, the tech rules at 5.2D do require a fill use plan submitted for the use of clean fill.
As part of a raw. Yes.
Correct.
Okay, thank you both so much. That's all we're going to do for questions right now. And then up next, we have Lynn Mitchell. You can take it away whenever you're ready.
Hello, everybody. I am Lynn Mitchell, the Assistant Director of the Remediation Review Element, and I am here today with Ray Strassler to go over the revisions to the Historically Applied Pesticide Guidance document, as well as to go over some commonly asked questions that we receive. Next slide, please. So I'd like to thank all of our stakeholder and committee members. They have been with us most of them have been with us from the beginning, and I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Ray Strassler to this committee. Thank you, Ray. Next slide, please. So what is historically applied pesticides? They were the chemicals that you see listed here. They're persistent in the environment, and they have not been used widely. They haven't been widely used in many years. That's why they're called historically applied pesticides. It's all in the name. Next slide, please. So They were applied like this. Next slide. Like this. Next slide. And like this. Next slide. And they were applied at agricultural properties like this. Next slide. At golf courses like this. Next slide. At greenhouses like this. Next slide. And I have been asked by my stakeholder members to remind everybody that they were also found at industrial properties like this. They were found along the fence lines or in the back 40. So any green area that might have existed in the past may have had pesticides applied to them. So if you are at a site and you're finding pesticides that were not part of your operations, that could be why. Next slide, please. So what HAP is not? It's not a mixing area or a spill area. It's not the dump area, which I used to always say is over in the back right of the property. Chris Dwyer always told me his sites always had it at the back left. But either way, it's not the dumping area. It's nothing like that. And it's not a new or recent pesticide discharge. For all of those areas, please use the SIRI-RA guidance document for soils listed below. Next slide, please. So what is in the HAP guidance document? The HAP guidance document gives you extra tools to investigate and remediate HAP. I'm going to go over when to sample and what and the functional areas in a few minutes. Background investigations, we give you additional information on how to do your investigation when arsenic may be present from application of HAP as well as from naturally occurring. And we also give information on remedial options such as blending, blending is only available to be used on HAP sites. If the exceptions are not written into the guidance document, it means we don't give them. So you still have to call in discharges and you still have to provide RFS, and most everything else still applies to HAP sites. Next slide, please. So who has to investigate HAP? If you are changing use to a school, childcare center, residence, or playground, you must investigate for HAP. Otherwise, you do not need to investigate HAP. Next slide, please. But if you choose to investigate HAP and you find HAP, you must remediate it. Or you can defer it if the site is going to be active agricultural or active golf course. For the deferral process, Ray is going to go into more details on that in a few minutes. But again, the deferral is only for the active agricultural or active golf course sites. Next slide, please. So this is a big question, and this is, before I go into this slide, one of the main changes we made in the guidance document was to make all the changes so the words are now in accordance with what's now in the remediation standards. So the guidance document used to say above residential, now they say you should compare your soil results to the ingestion dermal and inhalation pathway standards. We understand that we are telling you not to compare them to the migration to groundwater exposure pathway, and that is exactly what we mean. There is one use that we do ask you to compare to those standards, and I will explain that on the next slide. So let's go to the next slide, please. So when do we recommend a groundwater investigation? We don't recommend it all the time because it was so widely used, and it's hard to determine, which site it comes from. We are telling you, we are recommending that you investigate groundwater when there's a potable well is going to be installed or exist at the site, when HAP exceeds the migration to groundwater soil remediation standards and that intersects the water table, or if you're above the ingestion dermal and inhalation and you're within 2 feet of the water table and your compound is not on the immobile chemical list. Those are the only times where we recommend a groundwater investigation be conducted, but of course you can do it what you want. Next slide, please. So this is another area that was revised in the guidance document. We clarified the horizontal functional area in the fact that you should make sure that you configure when you do your investigation, you take into consideration your historic crop areas. We added that to make sure people understand that if you have two separate areas on your site, you might have different patterns of data because you might have had different crops on each area. So you should keep that in mind when you're evaluating your data. But your functional area can be as large as whatever size where the pesticides were applied. But as with any functional area, do not include data from uncontaminated areas. And I believe that's my last slide.
That is your last slide, Lynn. And next up we have Ray Strassler. Ray, you could come on camera. Oh, yeah, there was Alyssa.
You got me?
All right, we got you. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ray Strassler. I work in the Bureau of Inspection and Review, and I'll be going over the HAP deferral process and the REO guidance. Next slide. When is it appropriate to defer HAP? The use of the HAP deferral form, as Lynn had mentioned, is only for use on agricultural properties and golf courses that are going to remain as such. HAP deferral applies to sites when it's the only remaining AOC. And as Lynn also had stated, any contaminated site, any other contaminated AOCs on site, you're going to use the SRP guidance documents to remediate those. Once you get those out of the way and they're all complete, then HAP's going to be the only remaining one. Then you're good to go to use the deferral notice. Slide. Contaminated soil, you can move it to another part of one of those sites, agricultural properties and golf courses, as long as that area is going to remain active. Any soil is moved to another part of the site that's not going to remain active, you're going to need a deed notice on those. One reminder, the HAP deferral form isn't to be used for any other type of contamination. Slide. How to defer HAP. First and foremost, the instructions for the deferral form as well they are also found in the HAP guidance document. Refer to those. The next couple of slides are basically just a brief summary of the instructions provided in those. But to kickstart the process, the investigators first got to call it into the department's hotline. Then the LSRP needs to submit a confirmed discharge notification form as well as the annual remediation fee using our online system. Slide. Deferring continued, the LSRP then needs to file the historically applied pesticides notice, which is found in Appendix F of the HAP guidance. That's going to be filed with the county clerk's office. That notice isn't to be confused with the historically applied pesticides not addressed notice, which is used in RAOs. I'll get to that later. Once the HAP notice is filed, then the deferral request can be submitted to BCANE. Slide. One thing to keep in mind, though, during this process is the annual remediation fee is going to continue to be assessed until we receive the HAP deferral request form. So keep that in mind, just so you know your client's not getting any excess charges. Once received, the remediation of HAP and the annual remediation fees are put on hold until the deferral is terminated. Slide. Termination of the HAP deferral filing. When the property use changes, then the remediation of property is required. Termination of the HAP notice form should be filed using the model that's found in the HAP guidance in Appendix G, and that's to be done at the latest when remediation is completed. One thing to keep in mind is this might be easy to forget, so I included a little the checkbox at the bottom of this slide. The HAP deferral form actually needs to be submitted with a termination request as well. The site information is on the HAP deferral form, so it's pertinent information when we receive these requests. This way we know where to file the form and whatnot. So just keep in mind that we need the deferral form with the termination. Otherwise, we're going to be asking you for it. Slide. Excuse me, REOs. There's three scenarios which in which to address HAP in an REO. I'm only going to be focused on the first two. That is when HAP is suspected but not investigated. HAP is investigated, and REO is being issued for other AOCs at the site, or HAP is being deferred. and it's going to remain on an agricultural facility or golf course, as previously stated. The last one that I'm not going to worry about is HAP is investigated and remediated. Slide. So this is the other notice I was talking about, which is to be used in the RAOs, historically applied pesticides not addressed notice. It's not to be used, it's to be used anytime pesticides have been applied to the site but weren't investigated as part of the remediation. As Lynn had stated earlier, manufacturing, mixing, and handling areas for the chemicals isn't considered HAP, so this notice isn't applicable in those situations. Slide. And here's your last question.
We have our final test your knowledge question, so make sure when the poll comes up you are answering. It's another true or false. Use the notice HAP not addressed when the manufacturing, mixing, or other handling of these chemicals resulted in a discharge. True or false? So the question is up. You can select your answer. I think this one's pretty easy, and we're almost done, so lots of people are getting their question answered. About 80%. I'll give it another like 10 seconds or so. And just a reminder, we do have other trainings coming up. We have the Field Sampling Procedures Manual, Chapter 2 updates. That training is going to be on March 31st, so in just a few weeks. And that's something to look forward to. The whole Field Sampling Procedures Manual is being updated over time. So right now we're starting with Chapter 2 to train on. So keep an eye out for that to be posted in the next couple weeks. And we've had about a minute here, so the poll is going to close. Next slide, please. And the answer is false. So Ray, whenever you're ready, you can continue.
Okay. All right, home stretch, just a couple more slides. HAP not addressed notice continued. It's not to be used, this notice isn't to be used if you have analytical data identifying pesticides at any point, at any phase in the remediation of the site. It also cannot be used for properties going through a change of use to residences, school, child cares, and playgrounds. One thing to note, the HAP notice is for RAOEs only. It's not appropriate for an RAOA without a completed PA. Slide. Excuse me. Known on-site source not yet remediated notice. As with any other contamination at the site that remains, you're going to use this notice. So the two scenarios where HAP is being deferred under Section 5, you're going to use this notice for that situation, as well as when HAP is going to remain as an open AOC and you're going to be remediating it. An RAO should not be issued if HAP is being deferred and it's the only one presently being investigated at the site. So if HAP's deferred under Section 5, the notice will be included in the RAOs for, if you had other AOCs on the site, you're going to RAO those AOCs, and then known on-site source not yet remediated notice for deferred HAP would be included in that RAO. When it's the only AOC remaining, it's just going to be deferred and the case is going to be put on hold until it's terminated. Slide. That's it. Questions?
All right, we are going to take questions on historically applied pesticides. We have a few right now, so if you have a question, make sure you put it in the box, please. The first question is, what if the site use is not changing use? It's already residential and has been for years. A new buyer wants an RAO under due diligence trigger. Do they have to investigate for HAP?
So the answer to that is they do not have to, but if they want to, if your client wants the samples, then collect the samples. There's no prohibition for doing that investigation. We just didn't say it's a requirement.
Okay, the next question is, for a golf course that will be purchased for open space preservation with no playgrounds, does HAP need to be remediated?
So does HAP need to, if it's going to remain a golf course, then it does not need to be remediated. It can be deferred. But if it's changing use to an open space, it is no longer considered a golf course. And if you found the contamination, it must be remediated.
The next question is, does this interpretation of comparing to migration to groundwater standards apply to all projects or only HAP sites?
It only applies to HAP sites.
We have a couple more questions. We've recently had 2 industrial developers decline to sample for HAP despite historic aerials clearly showing orchards on the parcels. Their lack of sampling could potentially expose workers and adjacent residents to wind-blown pesticides. Care to comment?
That is up to you and your client to whether or not to sample. If you feel it is not protective, it is your obligation as an LSRP to no longer represent your client and no longer be retained. There's not a requirement that they investigate, but if you feel it's not protective and you do not feel it's protective to use the notice, then don't retain.
All right, and we will finish up with one more question here. Off-site childcare playground is owned by the municipality. If groundwater is still above groundwater screening levels, although kids play there every day, from a liability as an LSRP, A, is soil gas sampling necessary? B, the city access? I don't know what that last part means.
So if it is a child care center, then it is necessary to remediate HAP, and you so you're correct that if it doesn't, you don't need to compare it to the migration to groundwater standards. Wait, sorry, wrong question. If it's an offsite child care play area, then I'm not, wait, I actually, we will have to get back to you on that question. I'm reading it a little bit more carefully now, and it's not, I need to evaluate it a little bit further. I'm sorry.
Okay, and just a reminder, your questions will be answered via email. So if they weren't answered today, they will be answered in the near future. So I think that is all the questions that we are going to take right now. So we are at the end of our presentation today, so thank you all for joining us. As I said, your questions will be answered in the coming weeks. The slides will be posted on the Site Remediation and Waste Management Program training page for you to look at your leisure, and that should be happening in the next couple of weeks. And just finally, the reminder to do the Survey Monkey that you see here linked on the screen, and that has been placed in the chat several times throughout the presentation. It really helps us figure out what trainings to do next. So if you could just take a few minutes to do that, we would really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you all soon.